Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. I thought I'd start with something a little different today. I'm going to read you a short story from 1842. It's called The Masque of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. And I think it is somewhat relevant to the situation that we find ourselves in. Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores with dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest ban which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half populated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall girdled it in. This wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave means neither of ingress or egress to the sudden impulses of despair or of frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatori, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All these and security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was toward the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade. But first let me tell you of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7 in an imperial suite. In many palaces, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here the case was very different, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass, whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished and lighted with orange, the fifth with white, the sixth with violet. The 7th apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon a carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now, in no one of the 7 apartments was there any lamp or candelabrum, amid the profusion of golden ornaments that lay scattered to and fro or depended from the roof. There was no light of any kind emanating from lamp or candle within the suite of chambers. But in the corridors that followed the suite, there stood, opposite to each window, a heavy tripod, bearing a brazier of fire that projected its rays through the tinted glass and so glaringly illumined the room. And thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western or black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered, that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within its precincts at all. It was in this apartment also that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang, and when the minute hand made the circuit of the face and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that at each lapse of the hour, the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance, to hearken to the sound, and thus the waltzers perforce ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company. And while the chimes of the clock rang yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows as if in confused reverie or meditation. But when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked to each other and smiled, as if at their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows, each to the other, that the next climbing of the chalk should produce in them no similar emotion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embrace 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, there came yet another chiming of the clock. And then were the same disconcert and tremulousness and meditation as before. But in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. He disregarded the decora of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. There are some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. He had directed in great part the movable embellishments of the seven chambers upon occasion of this great fete, and it was his own guiding taste which had given character to the masqueraders. Be sure they were grotesque. There were much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantasm, much of what has since been seen in Hernani. There were arabesque figures with unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies, such as the madman fashions. There were much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust. To and fro in the seven chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams. And these, the dreams, writhed in and out, taking hue from the rooms and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as the echo of their steps. And anon there strikes the ebony clock which stands in the hall of the velvet. And then, for a moment, all is still and all is silent, save the voice of the clock. The dreams are stiff frozen as they stand. But the echoes of the chime die away. They have endured but an instant, and a light, half-subdued laughter floats after them as they depart. And now again the music swells, and the dreams live and writhe to and fro more merrily than ever, taking hue from the many tinted windows through which stream the rays from the tripods. But to the chamber which lies most westwardly of the seven, there are now none of the maskers who venture, for the night is waning away, and there flows a ruddier light through the blood-colored panes, and the blackness of the sable drapery appalls. And to him whose foot falls upon the sable carpet, there comes from the near clock of ebony a muffled peal more solemnly emphatic than any which reduces their ears, who indulge in the more remote gaieties of the other apartments. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life. And the revel went whirlingly on until at length there commenced the sounding of midnight upon the clock. And then the music ceased, as I have told, and the evolutions of the waltzers were quieted, and there was an uneasy cessation of all things as before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock, and thus it happened, perhaps, that more of thought crept, with more of time, into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who reveled. And thus, too, it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure, which had arrested the attention of no single individual before. And the rumor of this new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz or murmur expressive of disapprobation and surprise, and then finally of terror, of horror, and of disgust. In an assembly of phantasms such as I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such sensation. In truth, the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited, but the figure in question had out-Heroded Herod, and gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's indefinite decorum. There are chords in the heart of the most reckless. There are chords in the heart of the most reckless which cannot be touched without emotion. Even with the utterly lost, to whom life and death are equally jests, there are matters of which no jest can be made. The whole company, indeed, seemed now deeply to feel that in the costume and bearing of the stranger, neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed the visage was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse that the closest scrutiny must have had difficulty in detecting the cheat. And yet all this might have been endured, if not improved, by the mad revelers around. But the mummerer had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His vesture was dabbled in blood, and his broad brow, with all the features of the face, was besprinkled with the scarlet horror. When the eyes of Prince Prospero fell upon this spectral image, which with a slow and solemn movement, as more fully to sustain its role, stalked to and fro among the waltzers, he was seen to be convulsed. In the first moment with a strong shudder either of terror or distaste, but in the next his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares?" he demanded hoarsely of the courtiers who stood near him. "Who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements." It was in the eastern or blue chamber in which stood the Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. They rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was a bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where stood the prince, with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of this group in the direction of the intruder, who at the moment was also near at hand, and now, with deliberate and stately step, made closer approach to the speaker. But from a certain nameless awe with which the mad assumptions of the mummer had inspired the whole party, there were found none who put forth hand to seize him, so that unimpeded he passed within a yard of the prince's person, and while the vast assembly, as with one impulse, shrank from the centers of the rooms to the walls, he made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from the first, through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and then thence to the violet, ere a decided movement had been made to arrest him. It was then, however, that the Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on account of deadly terror that had seized upon all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger, and had approached, in rapid impetuosity, to within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which instantly afterwards fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of the revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, and seizing the mummer, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock, gasped in unutterable horror at finding the grave cerements and corpse-like mask which they handled with so violent a rudeness untenanted by any tangible form. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and died each in the despairing posture of his fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last of the gay. And the flames of the tripods expired, and darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. So Edgar Allan Poe, who was an American writer, of course, from 1809 to 1849. I guess he's credited with being the father of the detective story. And of course, he was also very highly influential in the science fiction genre, which was just then in its infancy. He made a great point of insisting that his works could not be considered didactic. That is to say, they did not prescribe moral instruction. It's difficult to read The Masque of the Red Death, however, without seeing it as a didactic story. And, well, what does it teach us? Well, I think that it teaches us, fairly obviously, the memento mori, remember you must die, or specifically with regard to the magnificence of the prince's castle, et in Arcadia ego. Even here, there is death. And this is brought home to us by the clock, by the revel being stilled once an hour. Why is this significant? Well, because the hour, the chiming of the hour reminds us that we are 1 hour closer to death. Now, that's silly, actually, because it is not given to us to know when we are to die. However, it's particularly relevant in a discussion of, say, the coronavirus, because we have been speaking much of average life, of average longevity, which in Italy, say, is 82 years. And it is held, seemingly, by the majority, that this 82 years is somehow guaranteed, which, of course, it is not. It is given to us, however, an understanding that the older we get, the closer we are to death. And so the chime of the clock on the hour brings this home to us. And in the peculiar, bizarre circumstances of the revelers in the Masque of the Red Death, this is brought home to them very strongly indeed. Now, there is a plague which has ravaged the countryside, and the prince has decided that, well, yes, those the poor people, those without the means, those without a castle, will have to deal with it as best they can, but we, the anointed ones, we can shut out death. And one clearly sees an analogy here with the celebrities of our own day, who are simply inundating us with their own masks of the Red Death, that they are self-isolating themselves. A great many of them are merry, but a great many of them are dour as well, that apparently to be shut up in a Beverly Hills mansion of 20,000 square feet is a horrible fate. Now, certainly isolation is horrible, but some forms of isolation are worse than others. The celebrities seem to be particularly taken aback by the coronavirus, I suppose for two reasons. That it becomes obvious to us that we don't need these people. Most of them produce nothing, in fact, that they are indeed famous for being famous. But the isolation does bring home to them the knowledge that they will one day die, and the whole of our society seems to be based on the assumption that we are not going to die. It is for this reason that old people are shut away, that drugs are used to make sure that dying people do not become particularly embarrassing in the days before death. We don't want to be reminded of our own deaths. I'm going to be talking about Blaise Pascal's Pensées tomorrow. And Pascal made very much of what the French call divertissement, what we call diversion, that all of the problems of humanity come from being unable to sit quietly in a room, that we're always thinking about the future and never the present, that we flee from reality. Now, this flight from reality is far greater now than it was in Edgar Allan Poe's time, for the reason that the media is ubiquitous. There is hardly any escape from it, and the media has decided that the revels of the celebrities are the most important thing that is going on in the world. Whenever someone dies, there seems to be little attempt to make a reckoning of that man's life, but instead we get pro forma or fatuous statements from the celebrities, our betters. And of course, if one wants to look at it in a more quotidian fashion, in terms of life or death in times of an epidemic, and of course the Red Death suggests the Black Plague, that is more than anything else a matter of luck. I'm going to repeat something that I said yesterday, that if this virus can be spread, by breathing, coughing, sneezing, whatever, from 24 to 27 feet, and that a distance of 24 to 27 feet is necessary to prevent contagion. And if the virus lives on metal surfaces, which we all touch every day without fail for up to 9 days, then the possibility is very strong that we are already all infected or very close to being all infected. Infection is a fact of life. We are infected with various viruses. Mostly these viruses are benign. Sometimes they become fatal. But I suppose what is most compelling about the Masque of the Red Death is, in the deliberate madness of it. That, of course, I understand the idea of the life force, that, that life must prevail even in the midst of death. But the perversity of boasting of one's wealth, of one's idleness, indeed one's usefulness at a time of mass death, well, I suppose it provokes retribution. Anyway, I was going to mention that, of course, Edgar Allan Poe was beloved by Charles Baudelaire, who was the man who brought him to Europe, as it were, translated his works. Edgar Allan Poe and Charles Baudelaire had a great deal in common. They were both damned figures. They both died young. They were both sensualists. They were both of a depressive, even fantastic type. And of course, their family situations were very similar. You have the phenomenon of the evil stepfather. Baudelaire's father had died, and his mother married again to General Opic, who Baudelaire saw as a monstrous figure, who was never giving him enough money. It would appear that his stepfather gave him a great deal of money, but Baudelaire was never any good at keeping money. And Baudelaire saw this marriage, his mother's second marriage, as being a kind of curse which followed him. Edgar Allan Poe's parents died, and he was taken in as a foster child, as it were, by the Allan family. And he held similarly dim view of his stepfather, or foster father, if you will, constantly fell out with him, was a dissolute youth who was constantly running up debts of various kinds, which his foster father was sometimes loath to make good. And again, Poe seemed to see his family circumstances as being kind of a curse on him. Of course, Poe was familiar with deadly disease as his family was ravaged by it and his wife was killed by tuberculosis. Poe had been, he had witnessed a cholera epidemic. These sort of plagues were commonplace throughout the Western world, well into the 19th century. Basic principles of sanitation were not really known until what, the 1850s, something like that. But no, I think that there is much to take from the Masque of the Red Death about our current situation. Again, perhaps more than anything else, the madness that events such as this induce in us. So let's see, what does the chat have to say? Oh, I was going to say, yeah, Prospero. I suppose Edgar Allan Poe could have seen Prospero as his foster father, or alternately, he could have seen Prospero as himself. I mean, Prospero, from Shakespeare's *The Tempest*, is a wizard and a writer, particularly of the fantastic, like Poe himself, is a kind of wizard himself. Let's see. Hydroxychloroquine. Yeah, we're going to be talking about that a little later. All right. YT. Average BMI 30.1. Well, yes, I'm going to be talking about this as well. What I reported last week, that of the British ICU patients, over 70% of them had a BMI of over 25. YT says, yeah, they pretty much all end up getting either cancer or kidney failure. Body mass index 25 is overweight, 30 is obese. Yes. Roger Corman's 1964 rendition of Masque of the Red Death was fantastic. It's quite good, actually. Features an 18-year-old Jane Asher, for you connoisseurs of female beauty. Of course, The Masque of the Red Death, I mean, you heard it. How long did it take me to read it? Just a few minutes. There's not the materials there for a whole movie, so Corman and his collaborators brought a whole much more into it, including one of Poe's other stories, Hop Frog, and also the satanic element that Prospero in Corman's movie is a Satanist, an open Satanist, and there is a satanic cult, which is central to the movie. It's funny that Corman, when he made B Pictures, he loved Edgar Allan Poe, and there was the suggestion that distributors of the film were unhappy with it because it was too arty. I don't know. Roger Corman made an awful lot of films, and some of them are bad, and some of them are quite good, but they are all entertaining. And the ones with Vincent Price, well, Vincent Price was great, and I grew up with Vincent Price, and I suppose that his movies were rather the model of the horror movie to me. Eddie Large, is a comedian. I'm not sure who he was. I saw his name in the Daily Mail. Died today with COVID-19, but actually heart failure, aged 78. Lecomte de Boreas says, who knows how many unknown viruses and bacteria we got? Indeed. The lipped one says, Dr. Fauci knows. Philip Daniel says, Joseph Holbrook composed a series of tone poems inspired by Edgar Allan Poe at the turn of the 20th century. Definitely hidden gems, presaging Sir Arnold Bax. Yeah, Joey Fauci. What is it? Ace of Spades is calling Joe Biden Joey Fingers. I think that is quite good. Mary Crow says, Baudelaire is an exquisite poet, though I see him in a Christian context, however, mapping the world of the damned in a sense. No, I think that is exactly true. I don't think there's any question about that at all. The Flowers of Evil was banned, but it is it seems to me to be a journey from darkness to light. So, Coachelango says Baudelaire wrote several uncredited Cure songs. Ho ho. Very satirical. Masque of the Red Death, directed by Nicholas Roeg. I thought he was the director of photography only. Let's just check that out. Hang on just a second while I look this up on Wikipedia. Yeah, Nicholas Roeg had quite a unusual career, say, before he became, the great art director. Okay, Film App. I'm sorry, this is taking far longer than it should. I apologize for that. It is directed and produced by Roger Corman, screenplay by Charles Beaumont and R. Wright Campbell, and cinematography by Nicholas Roeg. I hate to be the actually fellow. So let's talk about New York. This is what, within the last couple of hours, 1,562 deaths, 10,590 hospitalized, 49,700 confirmed cases. One of the problems with opening up dozens of tabs on one's computer is that there is a very strong possibility that that tab that you really need, you're going to accidentally close. Well, that seems to have happened. I was looking at a chart, an official chart from the city of New York yesterday, listing the deaths and listing those who had no comorbidities, as they call them. That is to say, serious underlying conditions, and there were almost none. Almost none. So these figures from New York City demonstrate what I've been saying for some time, that COVID-19 or coronavirus, it carries off people who are already in seriously ill health or have severely repressed or compromised immune systems due to already existing conditions. So let's talk about what's going on in the United States. This is very, very bad news, this story that I'm going to mention here. We've already heard that serious operations, breast cancer operations and the like, are being canceled because of this. This is from NBC New York. Grim new rules for New York City paramedics. Don't bring cardiac arrests to ER for revival. If you can't revive them in the field, EMT personnel have been told don't bring them to the emergency room. The guidance from the Regional Emergency Medical Services Council of New York applies to the city as well as Nassau and Suffolk County. Typically, if someone is in cardiac arrest, even if there's no blood flow, EMS units will perform CPR and other life-saving measures while en route to the hospital. Now, with very limited exceptions, that's not going to happen. So it would seem to me that this is an example where younger people are going to be sacrificed for older people. Why is New Orleans' coronavirus death rate 7 times New York's? Obesity is a factor. We're just sicker, said Rebecca G., this is a Reuters story, who until January was the health secretary for Louisiana and now heads up Louisiana State University's Healthcare Services Division. We already had tremendous healthcare disparities before this pandemic. One can only imagine they are being amplified now. Along with New York and Seattle, New Orleans has emerged as one of the early U.S. hotspots for the coronavirus, making it a national test case for how to control and treat the disease. Chief among the concerns raised by doctors working in Louisiana City is the death rate, which is 7 times that of New York and 10 times that of Seattle. New Orleans residents suffer from obesity, diabetes, and hypertension at rates higher than the national average, conditions that doctors and public health officials say can make patients more vulnerable to COVID-19. Okay, I don't have the figures for New York City, but here's Louisiana. Some 97% of those killed by COVID-19 in Louisiana had a pre-existing condition, according to the state health department. Diabetes was seen in 40% of the deaths, obesity in 25%, chronic kidney disease in 23%, and cardiac problems in 21%. Now, there's an obvious conclusion to be drawn from this, which is not in the writer's story because I suppose it is too sensitive. But New Orleans is a black city, a heavily black city, and the conditions that I mentioned are far more prevalent in black Americans than white Americans. We've already begun to hear of what we're going to hear a great deal more of. That COVID-19 is a form of genocide directed at black people, or that is to say, perhaps more precisely, that the form of treatment is a form of genocide, because black people are going to be dying of this far more than white people, maybe even in absolute numbers. Oh, and yes, New Orleans police are jailing people for minor offenses as the city becomes COVID-19 hot spot. Why not hotbed? It's perhaps it's the pedant in me, but I don't think this is too pedantic. That people use the word hotbed to mean something good, and hotbed does not mean something good. It means something very bad. A hotbed refers to an area which has become warm due to the presence of fermenting manure. Yeah, that doesn't sound. People use it to mean, lively or vibrant. No, actually, it is the very opposite of that. Let's see. One man was accused of stealing whiskey from a drugstore. A homeless man had allegedly refused to leave a hotel lobby. A woman had walked out of a grocery store without paying for a cart full of food worth $375, according to the police. What was she buying? That one cart had $375 in it. Was it just steak after steak after steak after steak? These are among the people the New Orleans Police Department arrested and booked into the city jail the past week and a half, as it became clear the city was at the center of one of the nation's fastest growing coronavirus hot spots. The cases were described by public defenders. At a time when many law enforcement officials across the country have released inmates and curtailed arrests to prevent a deadly outbreak of the coronavirus causing disease in local jails, some are resisting pressure to take similar measures. Police in New Orleans and other jurisdictions continue to lock people up for minor and nonviolent offenses. This business as usual approach endangers the police, the community, and the inmates. Public health experts say 2 inmates have tested positive at the Orleans Justice Center jail, as have 6 medical staffers and 11 employees of the sheriff's office, which runs the jail. You see, there's another example of anarcho-tyranny, that you all lose your civil rights, not even allowed to leave your home, but we're going to let the criminals out of prison. Now, let's say robbery, assault, rape, often murder. These people, who are engaging in these crimes, they're breaking the 6-foot rule. They're very much compromising the 6-foot rule. I suppose when they're let out of prison, they're given, a very stern talking to and say, we don't want to see you in here again. Don't commit any more crimes. It's good for you. So Mayor LaToya Cantrell issued a stay-home mandate on March 20th in an effort to slow the spread of the coronavirus through social distancing, which is all but impossible in a jail setting. It's all but impossible in a society, but never mind that. All right. Oh, yes. Okay. It's time for this man's preeminence to end. Dr. Anthony Fauci said that the United States will not come down out of lockdown until there are no new cases of coronavirus, prompting some to question precisely how long that will be. During yesterday's White House briefing, Fauci, who has become the face of America's response to the coronavirus, was asked by a reporter whether social distancing measures will be imposed until there is a drug or vaccine. Quote, I think if we get to the part of the curve that Dr. Birx showed yesterday, when it goes down to essentially no new cases, no new deaths at a period of time, I think it makes sense that you will have to relax social distancing. The one thing we hopefully would have in place, and I believe we will have in place, is a much more robust system to be able to identify someone who is infected, isolate them, and then do contact tracing, he added. This fellow has to be sacked immediately. What he's saying is, in other words, until both the economy and society are completely wrecked, this lockdown will continue. Look, there are people who have been exposed to the coronavirus, and we're looking at potentially millions or tens of millions of them in the West who have been asymptomatic, almost or completely asymptomatic. So we're looking at a situation here where a 78-year-old man or woman was exposed to the coronavirus, let's say in February. Nothing came of it. And then, they die of pneumonia in October. And it turns out they had the coronavirus. So we still have new cases, new deaths. This is potentially a recipe for shutting down the United States forever, certainly in the absence of a vaccine. But of course, not everyone, there's flu vaccine has been available for years, and not everyone gets the vaccine. This is absolute madness. Bill Gates calls for nationwide social isolation policy to slow coronavirus spread. I see that he left the board of Microsoft just within the last month. This is the company, of course, that he co-founded with Paul Allen when he was a student at Harvard University. Did he quit the Microsoft board because he intends to become the czar of the sanitary dictatorship? He said that, I think that pressure by fellow governors, the executive branch, the experts, should be very strong so that all 50 governors are seeing that they need to do this, and that is a strong social isolation measures, or that there is a federal order about the social isolation. The sooner you start, the less cases you're going to have, and the sooner we can all go back to some level of normalcy. Yeah, we're all just going to crawl into our holes, or into our caves like bears, and we're all going to come out in next spring, and everything's going to be fine. Look, seriously, folks, if we're talking about this lockdown going on for 18 months, maybe even as short as 12 or 6 months, we are looking at the potential of a Malthusian die-off. Because where's the money going to come from to pay for things? Where's the money going to come from to pay for government? I suppose the government can print any government can print as much money as it wants, but Weimar Germany, that was not very good for personal health. What with people having to drag around wheelbarrows full of money to buy a loaf of bread, and then finding out that even a wheelbarrow full of money was the next day useless. Ace of Spades writes, "Good morning, kids. Why bother saying what day it is? It's simply another grim milestone, the next day in which we are stuck in a surrealistic limbo as we watch our lives ruined, our economy put into a coma, and our enemies, foreign and domestic, salivating at the prospect of seizing power, all because of a virus. Yes, it is highly contagious. Yes, there is no vaccine for it yet. And yes, it has killed several thousand people. But after 4 years of a press aiding and abetting an attempted coup to overthrow a duly elected president and exposed as liars, after decades of lies to advance the leftist cause, and government bureaucracies charged with protecting our national security and safety in on the plot, you'll have to excuse my reticence in believing a damn thing they're telling me. Horrible as it is that people are dying, the way this is being portrayed still does not jive when you dive into the numbers. But for argument's sake, let's say I'm wrong. Let's say that in fact tens of thousands actually do, God forbid, die of the Chinese affliction. Could you blame me for being skeptical? Rush Limbaugh has the numbers to chew on to put on this a context. In the first months of this year, here's a list of worldwide deaths. Coronavirus, 21,000. Seasonal flu, 113,000. Malaria, 228,000. Suicide, 249,000. Traffic fatalities, 314,000. HIV/AIDS, 391,000. Alcohol-related deaths, 581,000. Smoking-related deaths, 1,162,000. Cancer deaths, 1.9 million. Starvation deaths, 2.4 million. And deaths by abortion, 9.9 million. I think that people have a great deal of difficulty in dealing with large numbers. You know, I discovered today, and it's not really surprising, that 460 people die every day in Britain of heart disease. Now, I don't know if I went up to people on the street and told them this, would they agree with me? Would they think this was a preposterous number? Would they think that I was trying to mock them? I think that they might. Oh, well, yes, never let a crisis go to waste. To further increase blood donations safely, real Donald Trump's U.S. FDA is reducing red tape and easing restrictions on gay men and other people wishing to donate. Back in the 1980s, tens of thousands of people died needlessly because they were infected with tainted blood. And we know who was giving this infected blood. The homosexual lobby has been howling in outrage for decades that they have been forbidden from donating blood if male homosexuals who have had sex with another man within a certain period of years. This is an outrageous restriction on their rights. Apparently, it is their right to poison us all. Let's hear from an expert. Let's hear from an expert. This is a British expert. His name is Professor David Spiegelhalter. He is, in fact, a professor of risk at Cambridge University. Sir David is a renowned authority, and he starts in this interview of him. By Michael Blastland. He talks about the data. What do we actually know about the data? Let's see, his interviewer says, we're doing it like this week simply because the team who made the podcast decided we wanted to hear more from David on Risky Talk, where he's usually asking the questions. This time he'll be answering them. And we want to hear about, especially at the moment, guess what, given that David's a world-leading statistician, are his thoughts on coronavirus. Where are we now? What the data we have can tell us. This is of March the 31st. He's asked first about a sense of personal risk. And he says, not too bad. I wouldn't actually be too worried about getting it. I think it could be very nasty. But we'll come back later to how we can put our personal risks into perspective. He's asked, which data would you focus on? He says, I think that this is the first time in an international crisis like this where there's been immediate access to huge amount of data. But you know, the data that's most easily available is on cases and deaths, and there is a problem with both of them. It's one of those very basic things that, before getting down and doing any fancy analysis, we should ask, what are we counting in the first place? And with confirmed cases, those who've actually had a test and been positive, we know that's a very limited view of the actual number of cases out there. People say maybe there's 10 times as many, but of course it depends on the testing regime. Some countries like Germany have done a huge amount of testing, and so the confirmed cases there might get closer to the number of people that have actually got it. But other places like the UK, we've only been testing people in hospital, not even NHS workers really yet. And so actually the number of people that are in this country with the virus is a deeply unknown quantity. With a common testing regime, as long as that's constant, you can use the confirmed cases to monitor what's going on, the trends up and down, provide some information. If the testing regime changes, of course, that all changes as well. I guess you would think what would be a good measure, to put it very crudely, is counting the bodies. But we found an increasingly what a tenuous measure that is of the fatal harm of COVID-19. Each country may be different in what counts as a death. Some countries are counting deaths as where you can actually say, this is what caused the death. In the UK, we were only just getting clarity from the Department of Health. They made this public just today, that would be March the 31st, of what these deaths actually mean. That the deaths being daily reported are in fact just deaths in hospital that have occurred for people who have tested positive. So strictly speaking, if someone tests positive in hospital but actually dies of something else, they still are recorded as a COVID-19 death. But those figures don't include any deaths in care homes outside of hospitals, and also the death figures are delayed. They're not the deaths that happened today or yesterday. Some of them are coming in from 2 weeks ago. Hospitals have to wait until the family have been informed and given permission. And it also seems clear that they saved them up over the weekend. And he talks about a Monday spike. And they went in one day from 180 to 380. This is completely impossible from a standard statistical perspective, assuming there's some sort of smooth process going on. We know what the variability should be, and what we see is vastly more than that. He says that both cases and deaths in early part of the epidemic in almost every country increased by 30% per day. So you get a feeling that at least the rate of increase is representing what's going on, even if the absolute numbers are undercounted or whatever. From the rate of increase, we can really get a feeling of how fast something is spreading throughout the population. Of course, the epidemiologists have built mathematical models that are being used to make predictions, and they've been using this kind of data to better inform the models. So the interviewer says, I've seen one statistician, John Ioannidis, call it a data fiasco. Despite that, are there things that we can say with some confidence? The doctor says, yes, by looking at the rate of change, we can get lots of information from that. Rates of change are unaffected by systematic underreporting. They're unaffected by whether it's done per million or just in the whole country, and so on. So the absolute rate of fatalities, asked about that. I've seen numbers around 0.1% or 0.2%. The imperial estimate, I believe, is about 0.9%. Is there any way of adjudicating between them? He responds, it's very difficult. It's highly contested. This is the infection mortality rate. The case fatality rate, which is how many people we know got the virus ended up dying, that can be estimated a bit more firmly. But the infection mortality rate, which is the percentage of people who get the infection and then die, depends crucially on, of course, how many people have the infection. And that's the one thing we do not know. The Imperial group are using on 0.9% as an average. They released some analysis of China a couple of days ago where they lowered that to 0.6. Other sources are saying much lower than that, 0.1% and so on, which is more like seasonal flu. These studies are influenced by places like Iceland, who measured, a lot of people, did a lot of big testing. They managed to test around 3% of the population and found a very small number of deaths. But that's Iceland. Yes, and I think that is quite relevant because from what I know of Iceland, well, first of all, it is an island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Second, they are fit people, the Icelanders. I've been talking about the situation on Vancouver Island where I live, where there are now the first deaths. There are now 2 deaths from Vancouver Island. Victoria, the city in which I live, is said to be the fittest city in Canada. I wonder about that, walking the streets and looking at the people on them. But that's what I keep hearing, that Victoria is the fittest city in Canada. And if that being true, one would expect fewer people to die, just as one would expect many more people to die in New York City, and especially in New Orleans. So he is asked about comparisons with normal flu or SARS or 1918. And he responds, the standard thing that people are saying about it compared to normal flu is that it's twice as infectious and 10 times as dangerous. And I think there is still some reasonably strong evidence for that. It's different to SARS. SARS was far more lethal, but actually much less infectious. And so we were actually able to keep it clamped down and controlled. I'm not sure about Spanish flu, but the crucial thing about that actually is that it hugely affected younger people, and that is not the case with this disease. He's asked whether lockdown policies work. He said, I don't want to make any grand claims at all. The plots I find most useful, and I'm looking at Our World in Data at the moment because I like their presentations a lot, is one of a log scale of cumulative deaths by country. And there the gradient gives you a very powerful idea of the increasing number of deaths. Lines that run in parallel are running at similar rates. The epidemic is taking a similar form. The very interesting controlled experiment, in a sense, is Sweden versus Norway. They're next door to each other, and they've got very similar population structure, very similar climate, but they've taken extremely different policy views. Norway has implemented quite stringent criteria, but Sweden is still really quite relaxed. And of course, we've got Belarus, who have volunteered to be the ultimate control in that they're taking no notice of the virus whatsoever. He says it will take some time to learn whether lockdowns had any effect. And he says that his questioner says, let's add a few more complications and some more uncertainties. There's a lot of discussion about whether they're really not preventing any deaths. We're just delaying them, and maybe not by very much. And he says that's an interesting argument, and it's recognized by epidemiologists. They call it mortality displacement. It's often said that hot weather will do this. For someone who's frail and vulnerable, hot weather might bring their death forward a bit. That's known as mortality displacement, or I've got to admit it, the technical term also used is harvesting. I suppose it brings up images of the Grim Reaper, but that is the technical term. So people have said. In fact, Neil Ferguson, the head of the Imperial University modeling team, said in evidence to the parliamentary committee last week that he thought maybe 2/3 of deaths were people who probably would have died reasonably soon anyway. So there's a couple of issues about that. First of all, it means perhaps that when we come up with this, we'll find out that the number of excess deaths in the country over the year might not be excessive. It might look just like even an average flu season in terms of the extra deaths. Now, I'll mention something with regard to Vancouver Island, which again now finally has deaths too, that it has been unseasonably cold here for months. That the average temperature at this time the average high, should be at about 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Yes, I just checked, 55 degrees, and instead the high today of 45 degrees. That is, that's quite remarkably low. And I suppose it could be that that's one of the reasons for the relative lack of deaths where I live. There are so many variables involved in this question, or in these questions generally, that it's more than a little irritating for people to draw up rules or models that will supposedly be the same everywhere in the world, and clearly they are not going to be for all sorts of reasons. So the good doctor, Sir David, says, this is the crucial thing. This is what I dread at the end of this. If these lockdown measures are effective, and the aim is, has been made explicit, to try to keep the deaths below 20,000 in Britain, if that happens, and people may look back at the end of the year and say, oh, well, not very many extra people died anyway, then the accusation will be made that therefore we didn't need to do the lockdown, which is not a logical consequence. It's only as low as 20,000 because we have taken these measures. Well, I have to disagree with Sir David there, that it is simply impossible to know whether the lockdown would have had any effect at all, for the reason that we don't know how many people are infected. We don't know when people were infected. Now, I said earlier in the day on Twitter that there are constant flights from Wuhan and other places in China to Vancouver. The Greater Vancouver is a very large Chinese population. And so it seems likely that the Wuhan virus has been in Canada since January at the very latest. And as of yesterday, there were 144 deaths in the whole of Canada, which is a population of 38 million. So I can only regard, and the country's in lockdown. The whole country's in lockdown. And so I can only regard this as either hysteria or enemy action. I spoke yesterday about the possibilities of enemy action here. And it could be that China has decided to make a certain sacrifice in order to bring down the West. And if that's what happened, then they have done a very good job. Of course, in this, as in all things, a correlation does not prove causation. But the Chinese, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, have not been exactly forthcoming. They have been economical with the actuality. And so Sir David says that it's too early to tell. It's possible that lockdown might work. It's possible that this is really not much greater than a threat than average flu season. So I thought I would highlight this interview as a rare example of a non-insane presentation by an expert. So I suppose the good news is that there's talk that treatment already exists. It's from the Daily Caller. Infectious disease expert Stephen Smith predicted Wednesday night that an anti-malaria drug is ushering in the beginning of the end of the coronavirus pandemic. Researchers have found that hydroxychloroquine, HCQ, a drug normally used to treat malaria, is also effective in treating the virus. A recent trial conducted at Wuhan University. President Trump recently waived FDA regulations to allow the drug and others to be used to treat coronavirus patients. Let's see, I've read stories that this, in combination with another drug, have proved to be, as Smith calls it, a game changer. But I suppose people forget of the power of placebo. That if you give patients a drug and tell them that it is going to make them better, it often does make them better, even if the drug is not clinically efficacious. It's too early to tell, but certainly we hope that this does work. Okay, people are already beginning to look back at how this came about. It's from ABC News. An ABC News investigation offers sobering insight into how COVID-19 has spread and penetrated so broadly, so deeply, and so quickly in the United States. It also helps explain why Americans, no matter where they live, must continue. Yeah, they must continue, says ABC News. Okay, here's the deal. 3.4 million travelers poured into the U.S. as coronavirus pandemic erupted. Travel data of passengers arriving in the United States from China during the critical period in December, January, and February, when the disease took hold in that country, shows a stunning 759,493 people entered the U.S. This is an astonishing number in a short period of time, illustrating how globalized our world has become. Just as people can hop continents with amazing ease, the infections they carry can too, said Dr. Vinayak Kumar of the Mayo Clinic. Those travelers from China included more than 228,000 Americans returning home and hundreds of thousands of Chinese nationals arriving for business, academics, tourism, or to visit family. Why are there Chinese students in the United States? Don't they have universities of their own? I know this is very lucrative for the universities. It's not very lucrative for the governments. Decouple. Decouple hard and decouple now. From the Daily Mail, poorly looking Boris Johnson takes to his doorstep from coronavirus quarantine in Downing Street as he joins thousands of people across the UK clapping, cheering, and setting off fireworks to applaud the NHS and key workers for a second week in a row. And there's a picture of Boris, and, well, he looks disheveled, but Boris looks disheveled most of the time, actually. I don't believe that there has been any of this. I think I might have heard some people banging pots and pans a couple of days ago, but it wasn't very many. I live in an area which is mostly apartment buildings. This is manufactured consent. Oh, we all love the healthcare workers, the so-called frontline workers. And so what, we're all going to cheer ourselves up in our isolation, in our lockdown? It's really revolting. Again, from the Daily Mail, we bailed out the banks. Now we need their help. Business owners fury as lenders refuse to hand out government-backed loans, with up to 1 million small to medium firms facing ruin. Firms complained that they had been refused money for not meeting loan criteria or offered rates of up to 30%. Others said that they couldn't get through on phone or told money would take weeks to arrive, killing off firms. but Chancellor Rishi Sunak promised the scheme would guarantee businesses up to £5 million at reasonable rates. Mail Online has been inundated with complaints from business owners who say banks are taking advantage. Banks taking advantage? Perish the thought. It's unthinkable. Okay, let's go back to the chat and see what people are saying. Oh, there's a clip on Fox 10 of Chris and his brother talking during today's New York coronavirus update. Yeah, I'm going to be talking about the brothers a little later. This is a Goose, Bill and Melinda's bogus altruism. I like that. I like that. Brandon Smith, Huang Yanling is apparently patient zero. Very interesting info on the internet about her getting bat blood and urine in her face, according to her colleague, Bo Zilao. Yeah. It's so odd to me because most people in the West are, they're terrified of bats. They're associated with, the supernatural, bad things, the occult, vampires. But in China, they just eat them. Stephen Molyneux. Okay, I'll get to him. He has been very upset about one particular aspect of this. Heimbach, I'm going to be talking about Heimbach a little later. I live by, Dionysia says, I live by Baton Rouge and my girlfriend is New Orleans, but she is half Japanese. Okay. Driss Dodu says that, or I don't know how it's pronounced. I heard that biochemical warfare that mostly kills your own people is retarded. Again, I'll go back to Mao Zedong. 250 million out of 750 million, leaves 500 million left. This is what he told Khrushchev. Lotus Wing says, the WHO says no travel restrictions in January 2020 to slow down the COVID-19. Dems want to kill production within USA by high living costs to support illegals. This cripples new jobs from scratch, wage lost value. Well, yeah. I mean, who is looking good out of this? I mean, we have no idea. We have no idea what the true situation in China is. Zero. We don't. People are speculating. Okay, Chris Cuomo, apparently he's suffered a great deal, or so he claims. There is no evidence for engineered pandemic. I suppose there's no evidence for it, but yeah, that doesn't mean that it didn't happen. All right. I mean, there's no evidence the mafia killed JFK, but lots of people seem to believe that. It's my own view that Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone. Okay, someone was asking about the professor that I quoted at length. His name is Sir David Spiegel, or as the Germans would pronounce Spiegelhalter, and he is a Cambridge University professor, and you can find the actual podcast and the transcript at riskytalk.libsyn.com. So what else are people talking about? Okay. Obama's birth records. Oh dear, how did we get that? How did we get there? Goose says not cool, Kevin, not cool. Okay. Oh, there's accusations of me hiding people? No, I only hid one person. This was someone going by a woman's name who was just making these kinds of Jew hatred stuff that would get me banned from YouTube immediately. There was just message after message after message. Yako Raipala says, back in the 1990s, when the end of history was the hype, Belarus kept getting mocked as Europe's last dictatorship that would fail at everything if it didn't get on board with liberal democracy. Well, as I pointed out many times on live stream, Belarus is not a particularly wealthy country, but its per capita income is more than twice that of the Ukraine. Just to give you an idea of just how messed up the Ukraine is. Ricardo Williams says, have you seen the videos of Chinese laughing about hoarding masks so Americans can't get them? Yes, I have. And I've seen a particularly disturbing video where a Chinese woman in a Best Buy or something like that is moving methodically through all of the laptop computers and touching them all on the outside and on the inside. And there's a black woman watching her, bemused, says, "Got to touch them all." Yako Rapila says, now Belarus seems like the last sane country in Europe still ruled by the same dictators. Yeah, we never heard anything about Belarus. Zero. We hear a great deal about the Ukraine. It's funny how that works. Is the Ukraine somehow intrinsically more interesting than Belarus? 50, 100 times, 1,000 times more interesting? No. The reason we hear about certain countries more than other countries is because the elite has decided that certain countries can be used to teach certain lessons. Brandon Smith says Alabama governor, isn't that the governor of Georgia, claims that he just found out today that the virus can be spread asymptomatically. Yeah. That is really hard to believe. But Jeffrey Neal says Belarus, 304 confirmed, 4 deaths, 53 recovered, 9.5 million population. Okay, I think I'm going to go back to the show here. People are losing their jobs, businesses are closing down, but most important of all seems to be is that Wall Street is made whole. As I delight in always saying, that of course the markets are not the economy, but we have been we've been led to believe that that is in fact the case. And there is a piece in RT by Mitchell Firestein, investor, banker, and author of Planet Ponzi. He writes, the COVID-19 market turmoil set off a chain of flashbacks in my mind from crisis to crisis over the past 4 years. They all fit together in a picture of Wall Street fraud and criminal policies with the virus as the last straw. Last week, I spoke with a young stock trader currently working on Wall Street. I remember saying, the last time I remember seeing volatility like this in numbers, my 40-year Wall Street career flashed in front of my eyes. I was like a deer in the headlights. 30 seconds of silence followed before I added, well, actually, the volatility we have seen since mid-February is unprecedented. In history, nothing like this has ever happened. It's a case of 12 years of climbing up the staircase only to be pushed down the elevator shaft with more downside ahead. Later that evening, thinking about my conversation, I recalled the highly rated Wall Street crashes I saw during my career. In 1982, the fraud at Drysdale Government Securities, Inc. made one of our traders on the floor frantic. He was wildly flailing his arms, jumping up and down, and threw the handset of his phone to the floor, smashing it to the pieces. All the while, he was shrieking, fucking Drysdale has gone fucking bust. They will take down Chase Manhattan with them, and the entire global fucking banking system. Repo is finished. Repo is an abbreviation for repurchase agreements. The repo marketplace is like a securities dealer's pawn shop for government bonds. Bring us your securities, and some other player will provide short-term loans. Shortly after his tirade, the teller rate screens flashed, Drysdale misses interest rate payments. Drysdale was crashing, and Chase Manhattan, manufacturers Hanover, and U.S. Trust were all on the hook. But luckily for them, the Federal Reserve was there to bail them out. The Federal Reserve Bank is not part of the federal government, and it is not actually a bank. It's owned by the big member banks and acts to protect banking interests. It seems they enable fraud and cover it up. The Federal Reserve called in the 30 broker-dealers, and an opaque bailout was arranged. Chase was on the hook for around $300 million, which was tax-deductible because its client Drysdale was a total fraud. 2 bankers were jailed, and this killed repo volumes for a few years. And then he thinks about the savings and loan crisis. I remember the Dow Jones New Board headlines flashing across the trading floor, numerous bankers arrested for their part in S&L crisis. Many of these bankers were jailed for a series of frauds and other illegal activities that took place. The S&L crisis saw 1,043 out of the 3,234 savings and loan associations in the United States from 1986 to 1995 go bust. Real crimes were committed and bankers were jailed. The Resolution Trust Company was born to unwind the more than 1,000 S&Ls in an orderly manner. It's been referred to as the most catastrophic collapse of the banking system since the Great Depression. And then came 2008. I still recall seeing a video of ex-Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan on stage with the then Fed Chairman, the Ben Bernanke. Greenspan, commenting on the Lehman Brothers collapse, lamented that if you have adequate capital, you do not have defaults of senior debt and you do not have contagion. Greenspan, aka the Maestro, continued as the Bernanke twitched, looking increasingly uncomfortable. I think there was rampant fraud in a lot of what was going on in these markets. We need to get far higher levels of enforcement of existing fraud statutes. Things were being done that were certainly illegal and clearly criminal in certain cases, by which I mean fraud. Fraud is a fact. Fraud creates very considerable instability. The Bernanke seemed shocked at how easily Greenspan admitted Wall Street's rampant fraud. Yes. No bankers were jailed, no banks closed down, they paid tax-deductible fines that were insignificant relative to the gains made. And the same players who were bailed out then went back to do what they do best. Too big to fail is now bigger, but with one crucial difference: the concentration of toxic risk remains in fewer hands and is enabled by Washington's pay-to-play swamp. As corporate debt hits new all-time highs, balance sheets remain riddled with accounting fraud, and enforcement hits all-time lows, we will soon see who is naked, and it won't be pretty. Last autumn, I warned investors that Germany's economy was falling off a cliff and was either in a recession or would be very soon. I cautioned that Italy's debt is a huge problem, and other member states and the rest of the world are not far behind Germany. Now, in March, you can expect and will need to prepare for a full-blown economic depression. Banks, politicians, and governments will scapegoat COVID-19 to shift the blame for over 30 years of fiscal profligacy, loose monetary policies, fraud, and the lack of any proper regulatory enforcement away from themselves and onto anything or anyone else. Eventually, taxes will skyrocket to pay for these opaque bailouts, reckless spending policies, and record low interest rates during the past 3 decades. Well, going back to this question of Key Bono, who benefits by COVID-19? Well, the bankers have benefited. Because if it's true, as many people are saying, that the collapse was coming one way or another, this gets them off the hook. It wasn't anything that we did. It wasn't the rampant stock buybacks. It wasn't out and out fraud. It was this pesky virus that brought us all so low. Don't blame us. Blame the virus. Or blame your fellow human beings, because they all want to kill you through contact. According to Reuters, law-abiding Germans, and are there any other kind, are zealously helping police crack down on people flouting new social distancing rules aimed at slowing the spread of the coronavirus by reporting on strangers, neighbors, and friends. Well, it's good. You see the continuum here between Nazi Germany and the Stasi of the DDR and the current government of Germany, of Angela Merkel. Yes, people narking on their strangers, neighbors, and friends. The police are getting tip-offs on anything from corona parties to people driving to weekend cottages. Rules introduced in March forcing restaurants, pubs, and sports facilities to shut and banning gatherings of people have given police plenty of work. With the number of corona cases and deaths climbing fast, there is no sign of an easing. Since March 14th, the police in Berlin have ordered 830 pubs, shisha bars, and other establishments to shut, and recorded 898 crimes. We are getting tip-offs from the public about open restaurants or large gatherings of people in parks, said a spokeswoman. Paul Joseph Watson, he put up a TikTok video for Britain of a policeman who, well, a whole bunch of cars congregated on this one car, and there's this middle-aged fellow there, and he's absolutely incredulous because the people say, you can drive home, but everyone else has to get out of the car. And he says, how does that make any sense? We're already all in the car, and if everyone else has to go, then this is going to entail more risk, and you're happy with that? And the policeman says, yes, I'm happy with that. Well, presumably he has his orders. Finland is told its welfare state can't cope with virus fallout. This is from Bloomberg. That's not good news at all. I'm looking at a picture of Sanna Marin, Finland's prime minister. She's a good-looking young woman. Apparently, the government is all women in their 30s now. Finns, along with their Nordic neighbors, rely on a generous welfare system to ensure that those who drop off payrolls still get some form of monthly support. When that safety net starts to crack, it risks upending the social model that underpins the high levels of trust in government typical to the Nordics. Look, if the welfare system is going to crack in Finland, it is just going to disintegrate everywhere else. Now, as far as Norway goes, they have this stupendous oil fund. That should keep them going for a while. Australia starts putting limits on draconian virus measures. And remember, draconian, no longer a bad word, now a good word. What is the turn-off period for these orders? It is 90 days. New South Wales State Police Commissioner Mark Fuller told a televised news conference in Sydney. People will have gotten the message by then, hopefully. And we won't be talking about the powers. We'll be talking about what does it look like coming out of this. Oh, just another 3 months. Let's see, May, June, July. Okay, that's into the second half of the year. An interesting piece from The Guardian by Bridget Delaney. Parents with their children, home haircuts, and no affairs. The virus has forced us to live in a weirdly moralistic way. A weirdly moralistic way. Imagine if you just got out of a silent 40-day retreat without Wi-Fi and returned to society not knowing about the virus. What would you think had happened? My first thought would be that a plain people religious group, think Quaker, Mennonites, or Amish, had become our new rulers. These groups live simply, homeschool their children, dress plainly, have a strict moral code, make their own furniture, spot home haircuts, and don't travel far from their communities. Just look at how we have changed how we live. And in only a week, schools are closed and children are being homeschooled, not in groups or centers outside the home, but literally schooled at home by their parents. Parents or carers who only recently set off for work each day and dropped their children at daycare centers or in school are now spending every minute of every day with their children. Yes, Ms. Delaney seems to be put out by this, you know. But I'm wondering if this lasts for weeks more or months more, how many women who have been staying at home to homeschool their children will begin to look at their office cubicle jobs or open plan jobs in a different way? How many of them will perhaps come to the conclusion that the game's not worth the candle? I suspect that it will be more than a few. In the American mind, William Upton, who I know a little bit, we have something in common. He has a piece, Make America Autarkic Again. He says, domestic supply chains, not global ones, will save us. The past year has seen America's industrial and consumer supply chains threatened by two critical giants, the rise of Huawei as a Chinese state-backed telecoms giant and the outbreak of the coronavirus. These two threats have laid bare the unsettling fact that the American economy has become so heavily globalized that we are unable to ensure consistent and safe supply of everything from pharmaceuticals to consumer electronics. So, autarky. This is that means self-sufficiency. My critics will more than likely dismiss this idea as either insane or reckless, but throughout the late 19th and 20th century, it was a policy that led to prosperity. In an overall globalized world, a policy of total autarky is infeasible, but a degree of autarky should be recognized as self-evidently in America's national interest. Well, that would be another good result. Further in the American mind, Gunnar Gunderson demands that the United States cancel all debt to China. The decisive move will show the CPC that we mean business. Adam Piggott, I guess I was talking about him a couple of months ago. He writes about the Great Boomer Plague. Yes, he seems to be looking forward to the wipeout, the genocide of the boomers. Yeah, that they deserve it. I keep hearing about Woodstock in this respect. Now, Woodstock was in 1969. I was 14 years old at the time of Woodstock. Certainly the musicians who played there were not boomers. And they're a silent generation. And the vast majority of the people who were at Woodstock were not boomers. To my age cohort, we found it all disgusting. With 450,000 people sitting in a giant mud pit, not our good idea of a good time. I'll mention that the attitudes of the late boomers were very different from the attitudes of the early boomers. The late boomers took a very dim view of the whole peace, love, dope philosophy of the early boomers. The cohort that was, if you look at the punk bands, the punk musicians, singers, almost all of them were born in 1954, 1955, and 1966. So, Vox Day. I would recommend medical triage and treating the at-risk over 65s last on purely logical, medical, and utilitarian grounds. It's obvious that they will consume more medical resources to less avail than any other group. But the fact that doing the right thing upsets and outrages so many boomers is not only entirely typical, it is also more than a little amusing. Yes, he talks about logic, but you could see the emotion there, that he's deeply invested in the idea of people that he doesn't like, a whole class that he doesn't like, dying off. Isn't he a Christian, Vox Day? Doesn't he claim to be a Christian? It's not very Christian to wish for genocide. From the Washington Post, shivering, hallucinating, beaten like a piñata. Chris Cuomo's haunted night with coronavirus. The virus came at me. I've never seen anything like it. Telling that he was racked with a fever of around 103 degrees that wouldn't quit. It was like somebody was beating me like a piñata. I was shivering so much I chipped my tooth. Then there were the fever-induced hallucinations. My dad was talking to me, a wide-eyed, Cuomo said, referring to his late father, Mario Cuomo. I've had bouts of flu in my life. I remember about a flu that I had in the 1970s, late 1970s, where I took off the better part of a week from work, and I was sweating profusely, and I was in kind of a hallucinatory situation. Everything seemed heightened. Reality seemed heightened. And then I would read a book, and then I couldn't keep myself awake, and then I would sleep, and then I'd get up and sweat, and, again with this strange, heightened reality. So what he's describing is not, it's not really all that different from severe cases of influenza. So Andrew Cuomo, a governor of New York and brother of Fredo, tipped by some as the replacement for Joe Fingers, Joe Biden. There have been pictures published of him which show very strange protuberances on his breast. TV chef Sandra Lee has shut down the she can't shut down the discussion of whether Democratic New York Governor Andrew Cuomo has a nipple piercing. She called the conversation nonsense after a photo of Cuomo sparked speculation that the governor had nipple piercings, according to a report published Wednesday by the New York Post. Lee and Cuomo dated for 14 years before splitting in September 2019. I just want to say that body shaming is not okay. It is never going to be okay when people are on the front lines. Oh, shut up, you stupid woman. Working hard for all our benefits, and then turn around and body shame. Shame on you. Knock it off. Do something to uplift people and make the world a better place, not take cheap shots that are unnecessary. Have a great day and think about that for a little while. It looks like it. I've seen pictures of him where, it looks like he has nipple piercings. Maybe he's a stranger man than we might suspect. Stephen Molyneux, very, very upset about this. He responded to me on Twitter yesterday. Janet Maslin of the New York Times liked one of my tweets. That was odd. Yes, Stephen Molyneux is, he is very much put out that apparently people are drinking more because of this pandemic. It's a story from Fox 5 New York. U.S. sales of alcoholic beverages rose 55% in the week ending March 21st, according to Nielsen. Spirits like tequila, gin, and pre-mixed cocktails led the way, with sales jumping 75% compared to the same period last year. Wine sales were up 66%, and beer sales rose 42%, and online sales far outpaced in-store sales. Nielsen said online alcohol sales were up 243%. And apparently, data for the week ending March 28th will be a better indicator of ongoing demand. Well, we shall see. Okay, so let's talk about the view from the island and the view from my country. These numbers from the Canadian government website, they say they're of April the 2nd. Yeah, but it's early in the morning. There were numbers added later in the day. Anyway, 11,268 cases, 138 deaths. Again, Canada's population of 38 million people. And so on Vancouver Island, where I live, as mentioned earlier, the first 2 deaths have been reported. Vancouver Island has a population of close to 800,000. There are 72 cases on the whole of the island. There is no possible justification for a complete shutdown of Vancouver Island. And again, I suspect, what else is at work here? Maybe there's more than one thing at work. But I suppose it could be simply that we're too stupid to run a society any longer, or perhaps we're just too hysterical, too feminized, too sissified to do so. And what's the big story in Canada is that the government of Canada has models. This lockdown is based on models. Well, what are the models? Can we see them? The government of Canada is saying no. But here's something perhaps more shocking than that. The Health Minister of Canada is a silly woman called Patty Hajdu. She said there's no indication, this is at a press conference today, that the data that came out of China in terms of their infection rate and their death rate was falsified in any way. And she said this was feeding into conspiracy theories. Okay, I'm looking at this video. There is a sign language interpreter on the left, and there's a different sign language interpreter on the right. One of them is in English and one of them is in French, I suppose, but I have seen the dual interpreters even where it's solely an English language audience. This is a big return, renaissance for sign language interpreters, because as far as I could tell, they had disappeared for a decade or more, but now they're back with a vengeance. And again, how many people use sign language? I go through a whole year without seeing anyone ever using it. I mean, except on television. Sean Lennon, who is the son, of course, of John Lennon and Yoko Ono, and a musician in his own right. I've heard some of his stuff. It's not bad. He is not happy with the Chinese. He tweeted, been listening to, quote, respectable, unquote, journalists quoting CCP official numbers for months without doubt or hesitation, calling it the Wuhan virus, but only days later telling people who say it's from China they're racist. The official media have lost their legitimacy. And then he retweeted something from Bloomberg, which said China has concealed the extent of the coronavirus outbreak in its country, underreporting both total cases and deaths, the U.S. intelligence community concluded in a classified report. Sean Lennon responded, excuse me, how the fudge is this breaking news? And why do we need U.S. intelligence to tell us what we already know? We live in a time that calling a virus that came from China Chinese is racist and arguably dangerous for Asians because morons. Oh, and calling a virus that probably didn't come from Spain Spanish, well, that makes total sense, says Sean Lennon. And calls mount for Ottawa to release projections on COVID-19 spread. And the media, or much of what I've seen, seems to take the line that no, that it's irresponsible and perhaps treasonous to expect the government to explain itself. Oh, we have some good news. You had these Canadians on this cruise liners who were just, like the Flying Dutchman, condemned to wander the earth forever. And the governor of Florida would not let them dock, but Trump intervened. And so now they're going to, a couple of hundred of them, 247 Canadians on the Zaandam and the Rotterdam have docked in Fort Lauderdale. So thank you, Donald Trump. Matthew Heimbach, a Wignat. I'm not a Wignat. I don't really understand what white nationalism is, but apparently I know that these people exist and they've existed for decades. There's not very many of them, but they get a lot of media attention for a very obvious reason, because of the media, groups like the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith and the Southern Poverty Leadership Center. It's useful for fundraising purposes and to drive public policy. I mean, Hitler's going to take over again, only this time in America. So Wikipedia tells us that Matt Heimbach, born 1991, is an American former neo-Nazi, white supremacist, and anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist. In 2018, he took the position of Community Outreach Director for the National Socialist Movement. He founded the Traditionalist Workers' Party, which ceased operation in 2018 when he was arrested for assaulting Matt Parrott, a co-founder and his father-in-law, in the course of Heimbach's pursuit of a sexual affair with his mother-in-law, Parrott's wife. Prior to his affair with his mother-in-law, Heimbach had assembled a community of neo-Nazis and anti-Jewish conspiracy theorists in a Paoli, Indiana trailer park. Yeah, you can see why this guy got so much media attention. A bunch of neo-Nazis in a trailer park. That's certainly a dire threat to the Republic. Heimbach is a defendant in the Sines versus Kessler lawsuit filed by Integrity First for America that claims that he and other organizers in the August 12, 2017 Unite the Right white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, planned and promoted violence against a protected group. So he appears to have renounced his beliefs. And I watched the video that he made where it's all about class with him now. You see, race was the wrong way. Class is the right way. That there's been too much concentration on race and not on class. So the organization that he's speaking to in his video, it's called Light is Light, is the same one that the former leader of the National Socialist Movement, Jeff Schoep, I don't know how it's pronounced, also defected to. Heimbach was recently kicked out of the National Socialist movement on the grounds that he's a communist. Uh, Alt-right, Brandon Martinez at Alt-right, says this is clearly a pathetic case of desperation on the part of both these men. I'm going to call him Shep, defected after going broke, facing lawsuits related to Charlottesville. He was tricked into signing over his organization so he could stay out of prison. Then he quickly defected to the anti-racist camp. Heimbach was largely discredited after he got arrested following an incestuous tryst and subsequent fight in a trailer park. Yeah. In the video, he talks about how Charlottesville was the high point of the alt-right. Now, he can't really believe that, can he? Because it just disintegrated. It pretty much disintegrated over the course of a weekend. Someone called Molly Shaw. I don't know who Molly Shaw is. She doesn't really identify herself. She says, second and most importantly, Heimbach has always used the language of class consciousness as a recruiting tool. He parrots a bastardized version of Marxism, which is a cover for his violent white nationalism, and says things that would not feel out of place in many leftist circles. My first experience with him, before you know him assaulting me, was watching him go from person to person talking about how the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Heimbach, and for that matter, a good chunk of the fascist right, understands far better than the Democratic Party the power of working class solidarity. Heimbach is, of course, not actually offering such solidarity. This language is only a means to and ends for his fascist, racist plans. So, he's got right with Jesus, or as these days, as they say, he's got right with the SPLC or the ADL. It's like about every 3 months now, we have this prominent conversion narrative of these people who've seen the light. I can't imagine, the alt-right, it fell apart, very quickly after Charlottesville. And, of course, there's always the possibility that Heimbach was a government agent right from the very beginning. My own experience in investigating neo-Nazi groups in Canada, where the largest and most prominent in Canadian history was paid for and directed by the Canadian government. This is not speculation. This is fact. The organization was called the Heritage Front. And it ended badly for the government, but everyone involved, including the opposition parties, decided that they were just going to sweep all this under the rug. You had an organization that, under the direction of a government plant, was talking about taking the war to the Jews. And a list was being created of all of the Jewish students at the University of Toronto. And I suspect, and I can't say for legal reasons, that prominent people in the media and in Jewish organizations were on board with this false flag operation. But as I say, when it went south, everyone decided that no, we're not going to do a proper investigation of this because it would be too embarrassing for too many people. Adam Schlesinger died yesterday. He was a songwriter, a singer, a multi-instrumentalist, one of my favorite musicians of the last, 30 years. He died at the age of 52. He had COVID-19, and I put up an RIP message on Twitter because I was very much a fan of his. And David Pinson used this as an excuse to take a shot at me over COVID-19. Someone on Peter Hitchens' Twitter feed mentioned Schlesinger not by name, saying that a musician very close to me, died at 52. It wasn't made clear whether she actually knew Adam Schlesinger personally. Hitchens pointed out the same thing that I said, that we don't know anything about this case, except there's a 52-year-old who had COVID and who died. He died on a respirator, which is a terrible kind of death. Now, who knows? Perhaps we will get more information. There's been talk about him suffering from a serious pre-existing condition, perhaps pancreatic cancer. I don't know. I just wanted to, say a few words about Adam Schlesinger. Most people would know him for his band Fountains of Wayne, which is what they call a power pop band, or college or alternative band. And it's just the story of this band, I suppose, is a story of the degradation of the music industry. This was a band that was signed to Atlantic Records, which for decades had an extraordinarily high reputation in the business, perhaps the very highest, certainly along with, I don't know, Warner Brothers and Island Records, of a band that, or of a record label that cherished quality and was willing to nurture artists. Well, by the time that Fountains of Wayne put out their first record in the late 1990s, the record industry was simply interested in money and a quick buck. But if you can't make a lot of money right from the gate, you're out. Fountains of Wayne was Adam Schlesinger and his musical partner, Chris Collingwood. And they're absolutely delightful band. Their first album, it was pretty much just the two of them playing all the instruments. That was in 1996, but Utopia Parkway. They actually had a real band. I think that they made 5 studio LPs. But, I think that perhaps my favorite album of theirs is a compilation, a 2-disc compilation called Out of State Plates, which is a bunch of B-sides and live tracks. These guys had a lot of influences, in a way that younger bands don't. It's all niche stuff now. On Out of State Plates, they cover the ELO hit song Can't Get It Out of My Head by Jeff Lynne, Trains and Boats and Planes, one of Burt Bacharach's and Hal David's most beautiful songs. And, of course, there's the notorious story of Max Martin's Baby One More Time, which was a huge hit for Britney Spears. They did their own version. Well, it's a very good song, and their version is outstanding. And it was recorded many years before it was released in 2005. They never allowed it to be released as a single for the reason, I heard that Howard Stern played it on his show, was hyping it. They didn't want to become to be seen as a novelty band, You got them covering songs by Jackson Browne and Gene Pitney. There was a very high level of intelligence and emotional acuity in their songs, which makes their relative failure. They had one hit, Stacy's Mom, which is kind of a novelty song, you could say. It makes their failure all the more painful. Adam Schlesinger, he went on to, Fountains of Wayne sort of fell apart because I guess that Chris was making no money at it. Adam Schlesinger had a whole bunch of other things going. He had his other band, Ivy, with a very smoky-voiced French woman, Dominique Durand. I quite like them as well. He wrote songs for other bands for the movies, That Thing You Do, which is a movie about the music business and one-hit wonders in the 1960s. Delightful film, and he wrote the theme song for that. Jody and the Pussycats, he worked extensively on the soundtrack for that. Much of the film, or most of it, was filmed in Vancouver, and a great deal of it was filmed about 4 blocks away from where I was living in Kerrisdale at the time. Funny story, my girlfriend at the time, she comes rushing in, and she talks about how West 41st Street has just been utterly transformed. They've got a Victoria's Secret, and they've got this, and they got that, and they got that. And I don't think I'd ever seen her look
so happy. And then I thought, do I tell her? I guess I'm going to have to tell her. It's not real. What do you mean it's not real? It's a movie set. Anyway, Josie and the Pussycats is a very funny and subversive satire of mass manipulation. And Adam Schlesinger wrote a delightful song for it, Pretend to Be Nice. He produced a Monkees album a couple of years ago. It was a contribution from him and Andy Partridge and a whole bunch of great people. And so it's very sad to hear of Adam Schlesinger's death, especially at such the young age of 52. And rest in peace, Adam. As I say, your music has given me enormous pleasure over the last 25 years. So I'm going to talk a little late, I guess about 20 minutes late, about Theater Thursday's movie, which is from 1992, and it's written and directed by Cameron Crowe, and it's called Singles. There was a very cruel piece in The Onion 15 years ago. Cameron Crowe to release only soundtracks, explaining that his movies were but a small step up in the pursuit of a career he has always dreamed about. Almost Famous director Cameron Crowe announced Monday that he was retiring from filmmaking to focus exclusively on soundtracks. For me, the moving image has become redundant, and I believe that I can more effectively tell stories with carefully chosen music, said Crowe, backed by Electric Light Orchestra's Do Ya. Crowe's first soundtrack, Walking with Headphones, will begin compilation later this winter for a summer release, with the soundtrack available on Polydor Records. Ouch. I have to say that choosing Do Ya as the song, that's good, but it's not quite good enough, because you would want to go, if you were really wanted to strike at Cameron Crowe for being a muso, you would go with the original version of that song by The Move and not by the Electric Light Orchestra. Cameron Crowe, he had, what's happened to Cameron Crowe? He had such a spectacular career. He was seen as a wunderkind. And his movie Vanilla Sky, which came out in 2001 and stars Tom Cruise, who's very good in it, it's seen as being a bomb, but it was not at all a bomb. It made over $200 million, and it made a decent profit. I'd say probably between $30 and $50 million profit. And then he made Elizabethtown in 2005, which, yeah, what can I say about that? And then We Bought a Zoo in 2011. And then he got to the point in 2015 where there was with his film Aloha, a stupid controversy about a white actress playing a character who is 1/4 Chinese. I guess he's become the official chronicler of Pearl Jam now, and he made a documentary about David Crosby last year. Of course, he went through a divorce. He's separated from his wife, who was, of course, with the band Heart, Nancy Wilson of Heart, in 2008. And yeah, I don't know, that can be very painful. But of course, he started off as a writer. He wrote a book called Fast Times at Ridgemont High, where he was very young-looking young man. And this has gone into an Almost Famous, which is a very heavily autobiographical film. So he had this idea. You see, he was writing cover stories for Rolling Stone magazine when he was 16 years old. So he had this idea that, okay, people are asking, what are the kids up to these days? So he decided to masquerade as one of those kids. And at the age of, I don't know, 22 or 23, something like that, he pretended to be a 17-year-old high school senior and wrote a book, Fast Times at Ridgemont High, which strangely seems to be totally unavailable. But anyway, it was made into a film which was directed by Amy Herkeling, and it's quite good and rather influential. He wrote a film next called The Wildlife, which is a very strange film directed by Art Linson. It's got an enormous amount of talent in it, extraordinarily talented cast, but it is really all over the place. It gives the impression of a film that was seriously messed with by the studio. So I guess as a result of that, this has happened to many writers. He decided that, well, no, I'm just going to direct my own films because there's far less chance of them being wrecked if I'm at the helm. And his first film was Say Anything, which is a charming film about growing up, starring John Cusack and the lovely Iona Skye. And then, of course, in 1996 came Jerry Maguire, which was a blockbuster, a film that everyone knows. Singles came out in 1992, as mentioned. I just moved to Edmonton when the film came out, and watching this film, I was just plunged into nostalgia, a kind of heightened depressive state, because I, spent pretty much all my life in Vancouver, and Edmonton couldn't be any more different. And of course, Seattle, I've spent a lot of time in Seattle. This was the Seattle before it became Californicated, and then before it became a colony of India. There's not a lot of diversity in this film, hardly any at all. And I just, Seattle is so much like Vancouver in so many ways, or at least, the way Vancouver used to be, that it was really powerful for me for that reason. Now, with regard to Seattle, this apartment building in which the principal characters live, now it's in the Capitol Hill region of Seattle, and I'm just sort of thinking, how many thousands of dollars a month would it take to rent an apartment there? $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a month now? Same thing happened to Seattle as happened to Vancouver. That there were the parts of the city that were, I don't know, as they used to say, funky. And you could get an apartment there for not very much money. And the neighborhood would have shops that were, I don't know, again, you could say funky, I guess. The same with clubs. And, now in both cities, all of those shops are gone, and they're full of places where if you don't have $500 to pay for a shirt or a blouse, well, then there's no point in going in. So Cameron Crowe, as we know, is obsessed with music, and this film is about romance, and it's about music. And Cameron Crowe said later that it was clear that this film was the inspiration for Friends. And rewatching it again the other day, I was thinking, well, obviously it is. And it came out, just before grunge broke huge. And who do we have in this? Well, we've got Chris Cornell and we got Alice in Chains, although, it's been said they're more of a metal band than a grunge band. You got Eddie Vedder in there. I was amused to see that The Stranger, and that's a underground magazine in Seattle, that we see people reading it, and someone was bitching about how Cameron Crowe kind of was guilty of cultural appropriation, that he didn't leave anything behind. This is our scene, man. We don't want you strangers coming in and trying to make a buck off it. I don't know. I think they would have changed their tune about a year later, because what happened after Nirvana and then Soundgarden was the record companies, the A&R guys, were pretty much instructed to sign every single band from Seattle. Yeah, but they're not really a grunge band. Are they from Seattle? Yes, then sign them. But there's a lot of Seattle, the old Seattle, in this. Wayne Cody, the longtime sportscaster, is in the movie. I want to mention there's a lot of cameos in this film. You got Bill Pullman. He's a very likable actor. He plays a shy plastic surgeon. You got Tom Skerritt, from Alien and from Cheers, playing the mayor of Seattle. You've got Jeremy Piven playing a drugstore clerk who had been a classmate of our hero Steve Dunn, played by Campbell Scott. Now, if you watch this, keep in mind this movie came out in 1992. Jeremy Piven is clearly going bald. Jeremy Piven is within 5 years of the George Costanza horseshoe pattern. But somehow he's got all his hair back now, and his hair is more luxuriant as ever. You've got basketball star Xavier McDaniel of the Seattle Supersonics. That's when Seattle had a basketball team. You've got Tim Burton as the next Martin Scorsese. You've got Eric Stoltz as an obnoxious mime. And let's see, even more, people who subsequently became famous. There's a lot of acting talent in this film, and it is well deployed. I have to say that. I suppose what is the movie about? Well, it's about being young, and I really have to give Cameron Crowe credit here. I've said this before about other filmmakers, but I suspect that Cameron Crowe has seen a lot of Eric Rohmer, and he's taken him to heart. Rohmer was a French filmmaker who he did a lot of films about young people, and they were not patronizing. Most films, particularly most American films about young people, are grossly patronizing in that they're not really treated as people. They're treated as machines for sex and for farting and the like, and stupid stunts. But the young people in this film are taken. They're taken seriously. It's a film about, I suppose, romance versus friendship, whether it's possible for a man and a woman to be friends. And I'll give you the answer to that. If there is a sexual attraction between them, no, it is not possible for them to be friends. It's that simple. It doesn't work. Now, there's video dating in this film. And the actress Sheila Kelly plays a character called Debbie Hunt, who works in advertising for a TV station. This film is, in a way, hard to take seriously because Sheila Kelly is stunning. She is absolutely stunning. A woman like that men are going to be chasing her down the street. But no, apparently she's so desperate that she has to sign up for a video dating service, and gets a very funny little clip made. And then we see the montage of all of the losers and scary people who have responded favorably to her ad. And the one she chooses is Peter Horton, who became famous in the show 30-something. And he's like the handsomest man on earth. He looks like a Viking. He's tremendously fit. And he's very charming. We see him in the kitchen with this poor girl's roommate who has decided to steal him. And he's improvising this routine about popcorn with a little puppet, little frog puppet. And again, this guy has to sign up to a service to find a woman. Again, let's look at Bridget Fonda, who is the female lead. She plays a character called Janet. I think that Bridget Fonda is quite possibly the most beautiful woman that's ever appeared in American film. And again, she has trouble finding a man. I don't know, maybe it's the kind of man that she wants. She gives a routine. about she wants a sensitive man, artistic man, this, that, and the other. Instead, she ends up with Cliff Pontier, played by Matt Dillon, who is a long-haired alternative musician and a moron. He really is a moron. Uh, Steve Dunn, who works for the city of Seattle, is a city planner. He says that Cliff has this kind of fierce intensity about him, except when it comes to women. And that's true. The film is it's rather lighthearted in its treatment of how badly men treat women and how badly women treat men. There are really no examples in the film of of women going nuts or of men being piggish. What we find out is one of the other female leads, Linda, who's played by Kyra Sedgwick, who works for an environmental organization, that she is charmed by a Spanish student who says that he's going to be evicted from America, deported in a couple of days, and he seems like such a charming, naive, romantic fellow that she hops in bed with him, and she starts raving about this man and how sensitive he is, and just his plight. She's going to save him, and then she's in some bar and she sees him chatting up some other woman, and it's not even Spanish, it would appear, and he's not being threatened. But that's about as ugly as this film gets. Campbell Scott, who is the son of George C. Scott and Colleen Dewhurst, he was so very good in David Mamet's The Spanish Prisoner 5 years ago. I suppose he's more interested in the theater than in movies, because he doesn't really seem to have attempted to make much of a career there. But again, he seems to be lovelorn as well. He's a handsome man. He works for the city. He's idealistic. He has this obvious emotional intensity, and why would he have trouble finding a woman? But I mean, that's the cliche of the film. We learned that Steve Campbell Scott had previously been an item with Janet, Bridget Fonda, and they broke up for some reason, which is never explained. With regards to Eric Romer, the theme running through his film is that there's no such thing as coincidence. And this is clearly one of the themes of Singles, that things happen that shouldn't happen. Things that shouldn't happen because of little accidents, and one gets the impression that Cameron Crowe, like Romero, thinks that it's all part of the plan. There's a certain nostalgia in watching any film from 1992, regardless of where it is filmed. Remember when telephones had these long aerials that you had to pull out of them? Remember when garage remotes were, like a brick? You remember that? You remember micro cassette answering machines? And a micro cassette answering machine plays a very big role in this film, particularly due to its tendency to malfunction. That at one scene in the film, after Steve and Linda have broken up, Steve's in a club and he has had, as he says, one too many beers. And he calls her, this is around midnight, and it's very funny because there's a bunch of idiots in the club pounding on the door to the phone booth repeatedly in the mistaken impression that it is, in fact, the door to the urinal. And so he pours his heart out to Linda, and it's one of those stop-start messages, and it's quite affecting, But it turns out that, the tape gets eaten. So he thinks that he has been rejected definitively. I was struck by the game aspect of this film in that Steve is very determinedly hunting Kyra Sedgwick. Also, he's attempting to, impress her with his words, and it's clear that there's a laminated quality to this. That he's worked on this. That he's honed these expressions, and I don't know. It doesn't seem like the right way to go around this. That Bridget Fonda, well, I don't know, maybe because again, because of her great beauty, Kyra Sedgwick is kind of a, average-looking girl, and they have these conversations. I don't know. Do these conversations ever happen in real life about, should we get together? Should we take a risk? That sort of thing. There's a very amusing role. James LaGrosse plays Andy, sensitive ponytail guy, and Linda had been with Andy for a couple of years. Kind of fell into it. That she says that being with Andy is like being alone together. And yeah, he really is the epitome of the sensitive ponytail guy. So Steve has a plan, and it seems very prescient now. The mayor of Seattle tells him that people love their cars. Well, especially in a place like Seattle now, it's not really the done thing to love your car. Steve has the idea for a super train, which is going to move people throughout the Seattle region. And it's going to be a very high class affair. You offer them great coffee. I'm reminded that Seattle, of course, gave us Starbucks. And I remember, I guess it would have been 1992 that, after I moved to Edmonton, 92 or 93, that Ken White, who later became the editor of the National Post and later the editor of Maclean's, that he showed up at a dinner party at Lauren Gunter's house, and he was just raving. He was just in this kind of state of delirium. And, well, what is it? Starbucks is coming to Edmonton. Yes, and I accused him of suffering from Seattle disease. There was a time, listeners, viewers, I guess you'd have to go back to the 1980s, where people were not obsessed with designer coffee. But of course, designer coffee plays a big part, at least as a background, in singles. But, they show the Pike Place Market. This was when Seattle was a very civilized city before downtown had been overrun by crazies and other nasty people. It's a time when it didn't cost all that much money to live in Seattle. I mean, Seattle was considered a tough port town for the longest time. It was a town of fisheries and logging, and sure they had grunge, but a special kind of frenetic rock and roll. Bands like the Sonics and the Wailers came out of Seattle in the 1960s, and even Portland had Paul Revere and the Raiders. It was a unique place. The Pacific Northwest was very different from the rest of this country, and Singles, if nothing else, has a great anthropological value. I don't know. You might get the impression that I didn't like this film. Actually, I liked it quite a lot because it is very well written. It is very funny. And as much as I try to fight it off, I suppose I am a romantic myself. Although, come on, Bridget Fonda, you could do better than Cliff Pontier. No question about it. But the heart wants what it wants, as Pascal said, and she is deeply committed that she wants to be with a musician. Looking at these musicians, I'm reminded of Pearl Jam, and the singer of Pearl Jam, he is a creepy-looking guy. Eddie Vedder. He's a creepy-looking guy. In this film, he's attempting to look goofy, you know, but still somewhat sinister. So I guess we get, one of the parts I liked best about the film was when the idea of the sky train is definitively rejected, and it's not made clear whether Steve is fired or whether he quits. Probably more likely that he quits. But he hunkers down in his apartment, and we see him after a couple of weeks, and it is just absolute squalor. And I put a picture of it on my Twitter feed when I was listening to topics for today's show. Just endless pizza boxes and every other kind of thing in the mail, unopened for days, and used clothes all over the place. And he is unshaven, and Bridget Fonda is quite worried about him and goes to visit him, and he makes a drunken pass at her, and he's bleary-eyed, and he says, "No, nothing wrong with me. I'm just regrouping. But we see him staring at the fax machine, doing this, saying, "Talk to me. I've been in that position, you know." And I don't know. I think this is a really good description of what depression is like. You wouldn't say that this is a deep film in any way, but it is. It's nice to look at. It's got good acting in it, with people who are sympathetic, and it's funny. So that is my review of Cameron Crowe's Singles. Actually, someone suggested that I review this. As I said, my favorite Cameron Crowe film is Vanilla Sky, which I think is actually rather profound, with the idea of longevity, extended longevity, living forever, the singularity, and the whole what is the nature of reality thing. So let's go back to the chat. Pascal did say that first. I mean, he wasn't really in a position to borrow that from Woody Allen. Okay. Yeah, Melancholia is a good movie if you want to know what depression is like. Okay, I think I have some insights into it. Andrew B says, I have the Sonics and Wailers records. They are really quite something, And Jimi Hendrix, who of course was from Seattle, was quite influenced by them, particularly in terms of showmanship. I was rewatching the Larry Sanders Show, and was it Dave Chappelle is carrying on about this pilot about Seattle. It's like, what the fuck, black people, Seattle? And I thought there was no one there to say that Jimi Hendrix was from Seattle. But no, back in those days, well into the 1960s, serious musicians played Gibson guitars. And the musicians from Seattle and Portland, they played Fender guitars. And that makes all the difference. Okay, we're talking about Driss. It's nice, good food, and it's cheap because it's subsidized, not to mention a full bar. Okay. Yeah, it just, I don't, one last thing about Singles. I don't really, I suppose one can use words to attract women. I just don't think it's a very successful strategy, because people can, they can memorize lines, they can memorize a shtick. Chad Chatson says Amtrak from Olympia to Bellingham. That's quite nice. Seattle being the halfway mark. The drive from the Canadian border, from Blaine, Washington to Bellingham, where it's just you're following this fjord. The I-5 is following a fjord and coming in and out and in and out. It's extraordinarily beautiful. If you ever have the opportunity, to drive from, Seattle or Bellingham to Vancouver, then yeah, you should definitely do it because it's breathtaking. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up the show right now. Tomorrow is the book club, and we are going to be discussing Blaise Pascal's Pensées. And I will be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. If you like the show or any part of it, I would be greatly appreciate it if you would click on the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you would like to donate to the show, my PayPal address is Kevin_Grace at hotmail.com. I wish you a very good night. And once again, in all sincerity, I hope you find companionship in these times when our rulers are determined to prevent us from having any. Good night.